If you were a flak gunner in World War II, the odds would be terrifyingly simple for you. 4 out of every 5 never made it back alive. Yet, they still stood by their guns, staring up into burning skies. Let's take a look at why almost 85% of flak gunners died in the Second World War. '88, the birth of a monster. To get a clearer picture, we have to start in the years leading up to the war. Germany in the 1930s wasn't supposed to be rearming at all. The Treaty of Versailles had banned it outright. No tanks, no planes, no heavy guns. But none of those could stop them. Behind closed doors and under clever cover-up programs, the German war machine was quietly taking shape. And here's the kicker. World War I had already shown the world that aircraft were no longer a novelty. They were here to stay. Reconnaissance planes, dogfighters, even early bombers had proven just how decisive control of the skies could be. By the 1930s, bombers were getting bigger, flying higher, and carrying payloads capable of flattening entire city blocks. The problem was, smaller anti-aircraft weapons couldn't even reach them, so German engineers were given a tall order: build something powerful enough to punch into the stratosphere and shred these bombers out of the sky. And as a result of that, the 8.8-centimeter FLAK 18, or simply the 88, came into being. It was mobile, could be towed into position, and operated by a 10-man crew. It fired high-velocity shells with time fuses that exploded right at the altitude of enemy bombers, scattering deadly shrapnel across the sky. It was accurate, it was powerful, and it could swivel and elevate fast enough to track even the quickest targets. The weapon was so iconic that its very name, FLAK, short for Flugabwehrkanone, eventually entered everyday language. Pilots dreaded it, soldiers cursed it, and anyone who faced it up close never forgot it. Initial trials. In the Spanish Civil War, the 88 didn't have to wait long for its first taste of combat. In 1936, Germany sent units of the gun to Spain during the Civil War, not just to help their allies, but to test their new toy in live combat. What happened there proved the weapon was far more versatile than its designers had imagined. Initially, it was brought to knock enemy aircraft out of the sky, which it did with terrifying efficiency. But the battlefield has a way of rewriting the rulebook. Before long, German crews were pointing their 80s at infantry positions, tearing bunkers to pieces, and even turning them against tanks. And here's the catch. Tanks of the 1930s weren't designed to withstand a weapon like this. Armor plating that could shrug off machine gun fire meant nothing against a high-velocity shell screaming in at over 2,700 feet per second. This was when commanders began to notice something. The 88 wasn't just an anti-aircraft gun, it was a multi-purpose monster. In Spain, it was already earning a reputation not just as a shield against the skies, but as a spear that could punch through whatever stood in its way. What nobody fully realized yet was that this was just a preview. When the world plunged into full-scale war a few years later, the 88 would step into the spotlight and change the battlefield forever. The 88 in action during World War II. By the time the Second World War erupted in 1939, Germany had stockpiled more than 2,600 of these guns. That was more than double what Britain had, while the United States barely had any comparable anti-aircraft capability at all. The Germans had guessed correctly. They were going to need them. The early versions, the FLAK 36 and FLAK 37, were already more refined than their predecessors. The barrels could be swapped out in sections if they wore down. The carriages were redesigned to speed up deployment, and a steel shield offered at least some protection for the crew. But the real breakthrough was in the fire control system. Think about it. Hitting a bomber flying at 20,000 feet wasn't just about aiming and firing. By the time a shell reached that altitude, the plane had already moved. To solve this, the Germans used a mechanical analog computer. Yes, a pre-digital computer that worked with rangefinders and later with radar. It calculated the speed, altitude, and course of enemy planes, then sent firing data to every gun in the battery. Dozens of 80s could be aimed at the exact spot where the bomber would be, not where it was. The result was devastating. In the early years of the war, Allied bomber crews quickly learned that flying into German airspace meant flying into a wall of deadly black flak bursts. And if that wasn't enough, the 88 was about to reveal its deadliest secret. It could be just as lethal when its barrels were lowered from the skies to the ground, from skies to tanks. The first real revelation of the 80s' otherworldly power didn't come from shooting at planes. It came at the Battle of Arras in 1940, when Rommel's Panzer Division suddenly found itself facing a wall of British heavy tanks. German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns might as well have been throwing stones. Armor-piercing shells bounced harmlessly off Matilda IIs, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the German advance looked like it might collapse. Rommel, never one to hesitate, gave a desperate order. Lower the 80s. The barrels, built to tilt skyward toward bombers, now leveled at ground level. Within moments, the battlefield changed. The high-velocity rounds tore through the British armor like it was paper. Tank after tank exploded into fireballs, crews scrambling for their lives. What was meant to be a desperate improvisation became a doctrine. The 88 wasn't just an anti-aircraft gun anymore. It was the perfect anti-tank sniper. Soon, the Germans developed specialized armor-piercing shells like the Panzergranate 39 and 40. With these, the gun could punch clean through 100 millimeters of steel from 2 kilometers away, distances where Allied crews couldn't even hope to return fire. For a time, no tank in the world was safe, and when the Soviets rolled their monstrous T-34s and KV-1s onto the Eastern Front, the Germans discovered again that their standard anti-tank weapons were useless. Once more, the 88 was the only reliable answer. Its role expanded further, evolving into the POC-43, mounted on tank destroyers like the Nashorn and the Elephant, and most famously, inside the Tiger I heavy tank. Allied tankers would shiver at one simple phrase whispered across the front: Tigers 88. The FLAK crew's reality, why so many didn't come home. And now, here's the part the glossy photos never show. The 88 wasn't just a weapon, but a spotlight. The moment a gun opened up, everyone in the sky knew exactly where it was. An 88 crew wasn't tucked away safely behind lines or shielded by concrete bunkers. More often than not, they were positioned in the very places the Allies wanted to hit the most: rail hubs, bridges, factories, oil refineries, and cities. In other words, if you were manning an 88, you were sitting right in the bullseye. Operating one of these guns wasn't a job for a lone soldier. It took a synchronized team of about 10 men: spotters, loaders, fuse setters, gunners, all moving in rhythm like the gears of a machine. But that meant 10 men clustered around a massive gun that threw up unmistakable flashes and thunder every time it fired. The Allies noticed instantly. Fighter bombers dove straight at them, strafing the positions with cannons and rockets. Artillery batteries zeroed in. Even enemy tanks would prioritize silencing them first, because everyone knew an 88 left unchecked could shred a bomber formation or knock out an armored column. And the danger wasn't just from the enemy. FLAK positions required mountains of ammunition stacked close at hand because the guns had to fire continuously to saturate the skies. A single direct hit could set off a catastrophic chain reaction, turning the gun pit into an inferno that killed everyone in it. Add to that the stress of working under constant bombardment, and small mistakes, like mishandling a fuse or overloading a hot barrel, could be just as deadly as enemy fire. By the middle of the war, the toll was staggering. As experienced crews were killed off, they were replaced by younger and younger recruits, sometimes teenagers barely out of school, as well as older men pulled back into service. Women joined in communications and radar roles, but the men at the guns faced the worst of it. Casualty rates soared. By 1943, estimates showed FLAK crews losing more than half their men, and in the last desperate months of the war, survival was closer to a roll of the dice than a real chance. So while the 88 became legendary for its power, for those who actually stood behind it, the weapon was less a symbol of German strength than of sacrifice. To be assigned to a FLAK battery was to know, deep down, that you were unlikely to live long enough to see the end of the war. Cities of FLAK, the towers. As Allied bombing intensified, Germany tried something different, something massive. In Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, construction crews poured thousands of tons of reinforced concrete into what became the FLAK towers. These were not just gun emplacements, they were fortresses. Each tower stood as a colossal block of war architecture, with walls up to 3 meters thick. Inside were hospitals, storage rooms, civilian shelters, and even command centers. On top, bristling with firepower, sat batteries of 80s and the heavier 128mm twin cannons, backed by smaller 20mm and 37mm guns to sweep away low-flying attackers. These towers could take direct hits from 500-kilogram bombs and keep firing. To the German people, they became symbols of resilience, hulking guardians over burning cities. And to the Allies, they were obstacles best avoided. There were too few of them to protect all of Germany, and bombers simply charted courses around them, leaving their terrifying strength localized. By 1945, though, the FLAK towers weren't just anti-aircraft batteries anymore. They became last-stand fortresses, crammed with civilians and soldiers clinging to survival. When Berlin fell, some of the very last German positions to surrender were not tank units or infantry regiments, but FLAK towers, defiant concrete citadels standing against the inevitable, the deadly legacy. By the final years of the war, the 88 was no longer the unstoppable weapon it had once seemed. Allied countermeasures blunted its effectiveness. Radar jamming, electronic deception, and dedicated FLAK suppression bombing runs meant the skies grew more dangerous for German gunners with each passing month. Early in the war, about 4,000 shells might bring down a single bomber. By 1944, it could take 16,000, and yet, the 88 still claimed thousands of Allied aircraft. Entire bomber crews vanished in fiery explosions or parachuted into captivity. To airmen, the black puffs of FLAK filling the sky remained the single most terrifying sight of the war. But for Germany, the cost was devastating. 85% of the men and boys who served on FLAK crews never survived to see peace. This is the paradox of the 88. On one hand, it was a masterpiece of engineering, versatile, powerful, and decades ahead of its time. It destroyed tanks at impossible ranges, shredded bombers that believed themselves safe, and became a legend whispered by both sides of the battlefield. On the other hand, it consumed the very men who wielded it. In the end, the 88 was not just a gun. It was a symbol of German ingenuity, of Allied fear, and of the staggering human cost of total war.